Hi, this is Paul. I want to continue on the theme about betterment, proximal and ultimate. Last week, or Saturday actually, I released this video. Proximal betterment relies on what ultimate betterment for humanity means. And I took some stuff from a couple of the Rest is History podcast episodes from Napoleon in Egypt and Neanderthals, and a little bit from Paul Kingsnorth's interview with Rebel Wisdom, and some from Robert Keegan's interview with Rebel Wisdom. And I want to do more work on that Robert Keegan interview today because I think this subject is important. There seems to be we have some capacity for proximal betterment with what I call dead reckoning. It's sort of A/B testing. Not being an alcoholic is better than being an alcoholic. Having taken care of your family is better than abandoning your family, and we're fairly good at this sort of proximal dead reckoning decision, and we sort of navigate by it. Difficulties come when we try to when big questions come in that are difficult for us to answer. Should you marry this person or this person? Well, you don't know all ends. And this great moment in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo complains to Gandalf that Bilbo should have taken Gollum's life. And Gandalf chastises him and says, even the very wise do not know all ends. And so what we rely on for kind of a chain of betterment is wisdom. That's the subject of what we've been talking about, because wisdom, this seems very Vervaekian. Wisdom reminds me of some things in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis videos. Wisdom isn't necessarily knowing all of the steps, although there are often many steps. And what cultures do often is that they create steps and teach the youth steps and model steps for people. First, you might meet someone and then fall in love, and then have a period of getting to know each other where I was just in the Discord server last Friday. I didn't reap any video from it, but one of the individuals, and he'll know who I'm talking about now, talked about the fact that when he met the woman that is currently his wife, he and she decided to break the pattern of which has become the customary pattern now of premarital sex and sexual intimacy, because they really wanted to test their relationship, to see if they could be friends, to see if they could be companions, to see if they could be a productive couple before the power of sexual intimacy began to impact their view of each other. And so they did this. And now, having married this woman, he is very pleased with his decision, which took sacrifice in the moment to one might say that required reason, which isn't a bad way to say it. They reasoned their way through the way that sexual intimacy impacts one's view of another. They decided to prioritize certain things over other things, and they benefited from it. And what wisdom often gives in a culture are a series of practices that are modeled and propagated, and they're sometimes instantiated in rules, and that makes a culture. And again, a healthy culture is a thing that affords betterment for people who have not had the experience to, or the opportunity or time to accumulate it on their own. And this is how human beings continue to develop and grow and learn from one another and go through time. Now, there comes points in time when certain practices and habits of culture are taken up again and questioned and tested, and some are discarded, and some are validated, and some are changed. That's sort of a normal process of culture. But perhaps we can talk about the great chain of betterment. I played some of this lecture from Wheaton College on the history of philosophy of Middle and Neoplatonism, this great chain of being, and the way that this chain has so deeply impacted our imaginary in ways that have been long forgotten, that it's difficult to talk about betterment, or now that I'm using a chain of betterment, that we have to wrestle with this scale. For example, after watching this and thinking about this, it strikes me again and again how often we sort of refer to levels of being implicitly when it's become completely disconnected from the Middle and Neoplatonism and the Neo-Pythagorean roots of these types of metaphysical assumptions. Few of us would imagine that we're so thoroughly egalitarian at this point. We're just so used to human equality before the law. At least that tells you something, that they're supposed to be equal before. We recognize, let's say, a qualitative difference between a dog and a human being, but we don't have this. Oh, shoot, I should play some more of it.
Well, this hierarchy of things is an arrangement that enables them to preserve the transcendence of God. That is to say, God is transcendent in the sense that he is qualitatively far beyond this earth, but at the same time as it preserves the transcendence, it facilitates the immanence of God. And keeping both these things in balance is one of the issues that arose in Greek thought. Plato's God so transcendent, out of touch with earthly beings. You see. Aristotle's God, beyond the outer perimeter of the universe, and in terms of efficient causation, unable to do anything among earthly beings. You see. But they were trying to preserve the immanence by virtue of the Logos doctrine taken over from the Stoics. Now, remember that doctrine. For the Stoics, the Logos was divine reason, probably impersonal, but some rational, unchanging, rational principle that embraces and permeates everything in existence, so that there are seeds of the Logos, logoi spermaticoi, seeds of the Logos in every particular thing. Now, if that's the case, then you see there are these seeds of the Logos running all the way down.
Now, you get this talk about, said male and female equality. I said men, the patriarchy is men being superior to women. Well, superior with respect to what? And you have schemes by which, humans are superior to dogs. Well, superior with respect to what? Well, they certainly have better smell, worse eyesight, better hearing. So what are we talking about with these kinds of things? Now, I just recently got a nice little video. So I want to do some more work on the Robert Keegan video. But before I do that, Oliver Murray just sent me an email, and he's got 152 subs, and he has 80 views on his Resurrection of George Bailey video, which he sent to me. And I'm a big Frank Capra fan. I've never really talked about Meet John Doe which is a movie I really enjoy. It's probably a Frank Capra movie that you've never seen. It was before It's a Wonderful Life, but It's a Wonderful Life has been a big it's been a movie that I've loved. And he has a little introduction to this that I think pertains to the question of betterment.
George Bailey could have been somebody. A wealthy engineer, a planner of modern cities, jet-setting around the country for a living, travelling around the world.
What do you wish, George?
Well, not just one wish, a whole hatful.
He could have been successful, but he never does any of that. He never does any of the things he dreamt of doing. Instead, he denies himself for the sake of his town and his community. At his lowest ebb, George thinks about killing himself, only to be shown, all along, that his existence, his life, is in fact a wonderful one. Let's look at the story of George Bailey, a hero in the modern age.
Okay, so betterment, potential, wisdom is the topic that we've been talking about in this little corner of the universe. And again, it's interesting to watch someone like Briz is gonna, oh no, it's PVK's crush on Chris Williamson. I haven't watched any of his videos for a while, but I was surprised when I first, I saw his channel and they were doing all different interviews with different high status people. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. That's the way you grow a big YouTube channel, and you kind of create for yourself. You can be a little mini Barbara Walters on YouTube if you want to be, if you can get the right hookups and then go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and create a big enough channel so that publishers and publicists want to get their people on your channel. And it's kind of the great chain of buzz, not Buzz Lightyear, but buzz itself. And okay, but that's always climbing certain hierarchies, and there's a chain of betterment that's involved, and there are telotic ends that they pursue. And so when we talk about something like in the Robert Keegan, the evolution of self, we're going to be talking about things like this. Let's see. I'll try and save you some of the rambling and jump in where I should.
Developmental theory, and you teach developmental theory at Harvard, and are known as sort of one of the biggest, one of the most reputed figures in the field. Why is developmental theory important?
In a way, developmental theory is just helping us to better understand our fullest possibilities. So,
and the word understand is into this. I found this video to be fascinating, and Paul Anleitner put me onto this video. And just this morning, I had a really wonderful conversation with Paul Anleitner and John Vervaeke. I think Paul's going to present it on his channel, what will be Tuesday, the December 14. I'll probably put it on my channel a little bit later this week. I know Paul's trying to build his YouTube channel a little bit, so you can, if you really want to see it right away, you can find it on Paul's channel.
A caterpillar is not meant to die as a caterpillar. It has a destiny.
Now here, caterpillar is not meant to die, and this again brings me back to Sam's wonderful conversations with John Vervaeke on, I should point them here because if I just say Sam, many of you won't know what I'm talking about. And why not just play it?
That's
Sure.
That's why I'm taking the position I'm taking.
So here's why I might push back on that a little bit.
Please,
so
please.
so there's a couple different ways I think to talk about sort of purpose in biology and evolution, right? So like the purpose of a polar bear is to hunt seals in the Arctic, right? So they are white because so that they can sneak up on seals. The purpose of their whiteness is so that they're harder to distinguish from the snow around them, so that the seals can't see them as easily, right? And they're big and fluffy because it's cold, right? And et cetera, et cetera. There's purpose in all of the sorts of aspects of a polar bear that are sort of, all centered on their purpose, which is, hunting seals. But, the polar bear isn't aware of its own whiteness, probably not, as the reason why it's white.
I think it's going to need some training. have to go to some seminars so the polar bear can be more aware of its whiteness. There's actually some really interesting videos on animals that are self-aware in mirrors. If they put a little mark on the animal and the animal is anesthetized, and they put the animal in a mirror and the animal sees itself in the mirror and can try and get the spot off. So anyway, I troll. So with that video in mind, listen to this again.
It's not meant to die as a caterpillar. It has a destiny to grow wings and fly. Developmental theory is just part of a bigger mission to encourage the greater realization of human potential, so that
So realization of potential. And we all know what we're talking about. We all know what we mean, but that is going to have a direction, sort of like the caterpillar has a direction towards the butterfly. The caterpillar isn't, well, sometimes it is, a direction towards food for the birds. Or I've been watching a lot of Survivor, early seasons of Survivor, food for the people on a TV game show.
fewer and fewer of our brothers and sisters die as caterpillars and more of us become butterflies.
Could you briefly outline your model and how it differs from other models? I mean, people might be familiar with, say, Abraham Maslow's.
Look, David has black slippers. Keegan has white slippers. Don't know what's going on there.
Hierarchy of needs, where at the bottom we have sustenance, and at the top we have self-actualization. I guess that was the most sort of, that was probably the one that made developmental thinking popular in the 70s. And people might be familiar with Ken Wilber's model.
Now, part of the critique I have for a lot of these systems is that, including Fowler's stages of grace, which some of you might be aware of, it's sort of this, applying this to Christian theology. There's been a lot of attempts at this, is that the people who are setting up these hierarchies don't often seem to be as self-conscious about the fact that in some ways they're talking about what everything is for. I mean, your highest level is going to be the, okay, now I'm going to, I said something about the summum bonum. I know some of you are like, you jumped on Bishop Barron for using that word, but okay, guilty. I can't think of a better one. The summum bonum. He spoke Latin. And so sort of what happens with these hierarchies is that basically the person who creates the hierarchy discloses their religion to us all.
As well. What are the stages in your model? And does it map on to those at all?
Well, maybe in different ways. My theory is often referred to as a constructive developmental theory, which means that it kind of brings together two very powerful ideas. The first is constructivism, the notion that reality doesn't just sort of happen up to us preformed. One of the things we do as human beings is give shape to raw experience. And
I find listening to some of these other people are helpful because, of course, I've been listening to a lot of Peterson and Vervaeke, and it's helpful when you listen to others because whereas I'm sure Peterson and Vervaeke would have all sorts of nuances about it, it's like, oh, lots of people are talking about some transjective realities whereby which we sort of co-create or co-ascend as we develop on our way up.
Make it into something meaningful for us. And that idea of constructivism runs through many, many different psychological and philosophical orientations. Then another very, very big idea is the notion of developmentalism, that is that living organisms and systems, including human beings, don't just grow in the sense of getting bigger and bigger. We evolve, become more complex. I mean, when a baby is born, when you were born, David, your head was a third the size of your body, just like every other infant. But as we grow, I don't become, 6 foot and have a 2 foot head, right? So there's a way in which we grow through stages that kind of form and reform. Now, if you take the idea of constructivism, the notion that we're making meaning of things, and the notion of developmentalism, and put them together, you begin to get the...
Now I'm not well enough versed with his nomenclature to know if he's saying meaning is something we're projecting on things, or if it's much more of a Vervaekian transjective meaning is something that we're switching, like in what I talked about, the first personal and the third personal, is that we are doing some making in that, but it isn't just sort of projection. It is sort of back to Coleridge and the waterfall is pretty versus the waterfall is sublime. The meaning making is actually engaged with something out there that I am seeing. Okay, and this again is very deeply tied to John Vervaeke's attack on nominalism, that the meaning isn't something we're merely projecting on there, that in fact the meaning is happening between us.
This idea that the very way in which we construct reality itself transforms across different stages. So there are, in other words, different logics that gradually develop over time, if you will, or we call them psychologics, because we're talking about kind of the essence of psychology, and that growing in our meaning making or even in our wisdom is not about just knowing more and more through a given logic, but actually having the underlying logic itself become more and more complex. In a way, to borrow...
So in Vervaeke terms, this would be an autopoietic self-organizing system. Well, what does that mean? That means that when we're growing in wisdom, and again, I'm thinking about Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where Vervaeke draws this little thing about robots. Often these videos don't really sink in until a couple of years later, and then I'm amazed at how much I actually remember from them. But not only are we, say, learning rule-based patterns of engaging with the world, and rules are tremendously important. Cultures have rules, and cultures have rules for the benefit of the youth. But also, along the way, we're learning to sort of look at the patterns between the patterns in the world, so that it's not the question of just if this, then that, but we begin to see that we've had no relationship with this or that before, but we've seen the pattern between this and that, between us and this and that. And so we look at that pattern and we say, okay, better not go there. And again, that can be fallacious. We can be wrong about it. We might detect a pattern that potentially isn't harmful. But we're always dealing with this. And so the wisdom and the meaning making and the sense making are not just we're developing more rules and we're accumulating more tidbits of information. No, we're actually creating patterns in us. So we've all been thinking about vaccinations lately. I mean, in the past, they would often have vaccinations which were weakened or relative viruses to the one that they're trying to protect against. Or even in the colonial days when they'd find someone with smallpox and they'd take a little bit of the pus and they'd cut you and put that on your skin. And it's like, whoa, that's hardcore. You might just get smallpox from that person, or use, monkeypox, or I don't know what they'd do. Now it seems like with a lot of these, and correct me if I'm wrong, because there are certainly people out there who know more about this than I do. They give you just a little bit, and with COVID, they're talking about, make your body aware of the spiked proteins so that your body can sort of pick up on that pattern without having to see the whole code. And now there's all this talk about the fact that if you're actually infected with the real virus and you get all the code, then your body is a little bit more aware of all the code because it's seeing the whole thing. Whereas if you just get a little bit in the vaccine, well, then that'll trigger an immune response and attack it and be good enough. So, this is tremendously complex. But again, it's not simply the accumulation of so many widgets, but it's the intersubjective pattern recognition by which we as individuals, and then also we as communities and cultures, sort of are able to level up.
A phrase from my friend Ken.
But again, level up implies ultimate betterment, and that, well, there's also going to have to be error checking in the chain of betterment, because what we find with human beings is that we keep doing this proximal betterment, and then we find ourselves in a dead end. And then we got to backtrack and then start down another road. It's sort of like working your way through a maze, and, oh, this looks promising, this looks promising. So keep going through it until you hit a dead end. It's like, okay, now we got to backtrack and we got to try another route. I mean, we have those experiences all the time.
Wilbur, that transcends but includes the prior logic. So Ken, I think, is one of the great synthetic thinkers on the planet, and he brings together a whole lot of different wisdom traditions, and in Western academia it would be more lines of research. And I think one of the most useful of his heuristics is that kind of four-box model that kind of underlies the notion of taking a more integrated or holistic perspective on any phenomenon. And those four boxes, which I'm sure many of those looking at this are familiar with, but just in case they're not, is kind of just think about the difference between the individual level and the collective level, and then think about the difference between the interior and the exterior. And that gives you these four boxes. Now, if you zoom in on one of those quadrants, thinking about the interior development of the individual, that's the box in which, I spent the first part of my professional life working largely as a theorist to better understand the gradual evolutions of interior individual development, standing initially on the shoulders of Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist, who was the first to kind of elucidate stages of child development, and in particular the ways that children organize the physical world and kind of their cognition. And my work has been to widen the aperture from cognition to the ways in which we organize all the primary quadrants of personality, how we think, yes, but also how we feel, how we construct our social relations with others, and how we construct our interior relationships to parts of ourselves. And so my theory kind of opened the aperture beyond just cognition, and then extended the study beyond children and adolescents, which is kind of where Piaget ended, to sort of consider the question, is there life after adolescence? And can we actually continue to grow psychologically even when we've reached our full height physically? I mean, literally, when I started graduate school at Harvard in the 1970s, if you were a developmental psychologist, it meant you studied infants, children, or adolescents. End of story, because that was the period, the first 20 years of life, let's say, when we believed psychological development actually occurred. We'd yoked our notions of physical development to psychological development, and just as most of us reach our full physical stature, let's say in our 20s, early 20s, it was believed that that was kind of the end state for the development of the brain even, and brain scientists were very adamant. What are we talking?
I found this point to be fascinating. And yeah, I found this point to be fascinating.
Talking about 40 years ago now, maybe, that there were no further qualitative transformations in brain material after about the first 20 years of life. And
so yesterday I was making this video, and we were having a storm in Sacramento, and the power went out in the whole neighborhood, including here in the church. So I'll trim up that video a little bit, and we'll keep going a day later.
Or adolescence, end of story, because that was the period, the first 20 years of life, let's say, when we believed psychological development actually occurred. we had yoked our notions of physical development to psychological development, and just as most of us reach our full physical stature, let's say in our 20s, early 20s, it was believed that that was kind of the end state for the development of the brain even, and brain scientists were very adamant. What are we talking about, 40 years ago now maybe, that there were no further qualitative transformations in brain material after about the first 20 years of life.
Now, what's so interesting about that is, again, the connection in modernity in the assumption between brain and mind. And so if we look at the body and we say, well, transformation has occurred, brain and mind stay the same, there's the function. But that's today that would simply not be accepted, and it isn't accepted.
And our research and my colleagues and I basically never felt that seemed very sensible. I mean, just by common sense, you live among adults and you see that some people seem to be kind of making meaning and qualitatively perceiving the world at a greater depth, than others. And so we began to kind of explore all that. And today, and I have many friends who are, quote, hard scientists, neuroscientists, and, today they have recanted that kind of constricted dogma and all talk now about the phenomenal neuroplasticity of the brain. It's kind of
interesting use of the word dogma there. Of course, sort of a casting shade on religion in one way, talking about sort of obsolete science perhaps, but still an interesting use of the word, revealed from on high, that has been discredited.
One of the few instances in which the soft scientists, we psychologists, were actually maybe a bit out ahead of the hard scientists.
That's Norman Doidge, for example, the brain that changes itself, and the idea of neuroplasticity.
Yeah, thinking fast, thinking slow, Kahneman. I mean, I think all of neuroscience has recanted the notion that, the brain is basically done in terms of its development. I mean, even then, of course, people probably would grant this notion that some people seem to be wiser than others, but they attributed that largely to the fact that some people were getting more out of the same equipment than other people, and that experience, of course, matters. And so some people...
And so in that sense, perhaps the equipment was static, in that no matter what programs I run through my PC, the chip on the PC remains static. It remains the same, whereas ideas of brain plasticity, there's again more of an interplay between the material, the mind and the material, the upper and lower registers.
Are wiser, not because they're actually kind of making sense of the world with an upgraded system, but rather that they're just learning how to get more out of the same system. And I think what we've come to show is, no, the system itself, which we have long understood, goes through qualitative transformations in childhood and adolescence, has the potential to continue transforming on into our 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond.
And could you outline what the basic distinctions are in the model? I'm aware of some of the terms. You talk about the socialized mind and the self-authoring mind, for example. Could you outline what those are and what those mean?
Sure. So I'll give you a concrete example, since these things are often like pictures worth 1,000 words. I was talking with a social worker the other day who works with adolescents who have come out of the court system and who've committed, crimes and so on. And she was talking about a young man, maybe 16, 17 years old, who had a record of auto theft. And she'd been working, with him, and she told me about a session she had with him where he came to her and said, you'd be proud of me because I know I shouldn't, but I still do hang out with a number of rough friends who could easily get me in trouble. And, just this weekend, I was hanging out with them, and they wanted to wanted me to join them in stealing a car. And ordinarily, I might have just gone along with that. And because of our work together, I didn't. She was like, well, I'm really glad to hear about that, sort of tell me a little bit more. And he said, well, they wanted me to steal this car. And I was going to, and I stopped and I thought to myself, if I steal this car, there's a very good chance we're going to get caught. If I get caught, because I'm on probation, unlike these other friends, they're going to get let off. I'm going to go back to jail. And she said to him, well, I'm really glad, Bernard, that you didn't steal the car. But I have to be honest and say that I wish the reason you'd chosen not to steal the car was not just that if you did, you might go to jail, but because you gave some thought to kind of how that person would feel and the fact that it's his car, it's not your car, and that he would naturally feel bad.
I find this illustration absolutely fascinating because, okay, who is the social worker? What is her goal? Well, her goal is, to one degree or another, for her client, let's use that medical terminology, betterment. Okay, and so it's certainly better for him to not go to jail than to go to jail. So there's proximal betterment. And the reason his cognition, what he used to figure out and to motivate himself to not go along with his friends and steal the car, was anticipating a negative outcome. And so he used reason, sort of transcended himself and, frame shifted into the future, imagined himself in jail, said this isn't a good outcome. These guys will get away with it. I won't. So I'm not going to. And then now he's in the room with the social worker looking, in a sense, for positive reinforcement. And now she wants him to go to another level. And that level is, no, you have to frame shift now, not yourself into the future, but you have to frame shift now you into the other person and see the world from this other person. And this other person will feel bad, and therefore you shouldn't do it. Now, this is fascinating because, of course, what the social worker has in her mind is a hierarchy. And there are a lot of different levels to this move than he will bring out. Now, I'm not, trying to pick on him or David or anything like that. I just found this to be a fascinatingly productive illustration. I just also found, because you have to ask a number of questions about, let's say, the context, which is, well, there's a legal context in which he would go to jail. I just had a visit from a friend here in my office. I'm going to talk to him next week. And he's been teaching in a local public school, and he gets a chance to ask kids. To his horror, he discovered that the kids in this particular neighborhood where the school is, and the school's in a rough neighborhood in Sacramento, they gave him moral relativistic answers to his questions. There's no right and wrong. There's maybe harm, but other than that, no right and wrong. Well, this idea of a system in which the feelings of others are, in fact, the adjudication of right and wrong, well, most of us can pretty quickly see that sort of system is, on one hand, astoundingly promoted now. It's the feelings of others that have become sort of the thing at the top of the hierarchy with which should, in some ways, guide our behaviors. Yet, implicitly in almost all of this, there are some peoples whose feelings are sacrosanct and sacred, and other peoples whose feelings are legitimately violated. And that also is constructed around us. Now, while I watch this, the Google algorithm that Yuval Harari says is our future religion, our future God, pulled me up a little doodle, some drawings by a post-evangelical Lutheran pastor who looks at Keegan's 5 levels of consciousness, and and he gives permission on his YouTube channel to use this. So I might just drop this thing whole into this video because I thought it was really good. And yeah, I'm doing a little bit more editing now. But I just want us to pause on this illustration. Now let's see where he takes it. I've got a convo in 15 minutes, so I got to keep moving and figure out what I'm going to do with this video. I usually do these all in one sitting. So.
And she said, he just looked right at me and he said, yes, but I'm not there yet.
So he recognizes a hierarchy, and he wants to please or put off the social worker. And, well, interesting.
And she sat back and she thought, that was a beautiful answer. That he was being absolutely truthful, and that her hope for him was a little further ahead of kind of where he was. And, she was...
Okay, well, now we've got a hierarchy. And now we've got, in some ways, I don't want to use this word, at least a presumably objective hierarchy, or at least an intersubjective hierarchy that both of the two are, at least, if they're speaking in good faith, agreeing on. Either that, or he's just telling the social worker what the social worker wants to hear, which, as a pastor, I'm well aware of that dynamic.
Kind of telling a story on herself, kind of saying how, you can learn from your clients, even from your 16-year-old clients. Now, when he said, I'm not quite there yet, from a developmentalist point of view, we would also feel like he was telling a very important truth. What he is saying was, just give me credit for the fact I didn't steal the car. But my underlying logic is still about what's kind of in my best interest. And the reason I didn't steal it was because I had at least enough foresight to consider that I could get caught, I could get sent to jail. That is itself a given stage of development. It is the stage of...
The camera work on this is driving me a little crazy, David. I don't know if you had this, if you fixed the focus. I know you use those. I think you use Canon D80s on your interviews. And focus.
It comes before the socialized mind. What she was hoping for was a qualitatively different stage where people live not only to pursue their own interests and kind of look at others as sort of opportunities to get their own needs met or obstacles to getting their needs met.
And I love that, opportunities and obstacles is basically what Peterson says. This is what we see at a certain level. Again, we're using seeing sort of metaphorically, not physically. We see obstacles and objects. That's how we are relating to, in terms of our mind is seeing obstacles and opportunities. Let's say it that way.
But where you actually begin to internalize something of the values and beliefs of others around you, it starts with your society.
You're being colonized. That's what he's talking about. You're internalizing the mappings of your tribe. And again, I don't want the dude stealing cars, but this is what we're talking about. And what's amazing about this is that especially in the 60s, we've had this conversation as a culture about conformity. The rebel has status, and the conformist, this is big, especially in the 1950s, the conformist is the company man. He's we might say today, he's the zombie.
As that might get conveyed through your immediate family or your faith community, others beyond it. And eventually, there's the possibility that I start relating to others, family members, friends, society, not just in terms of getting my own needs met, but where I actually become more a part of society because society has become more a part of me. I begin to internalize the values, beliefs, and expectations of important people around me. We call...
Okay, so this is actually participating, let's call it participating in a principality. And as he develops his schema here, and again, I'm not strawmanning his schema. I'm going to play that video because I think once you see the video that this pastor did about this, you'll have a better understanding that throws a lot of light on this video in terms of what he's talking about in terms of these levels of consciousness, as he calls it. Boy, that word can get a little overused and threadbare. We're using it just sort of all over the place, which seems to demonstrate that we're increasingly a little bit adrift in terms of what on earth we're talking about.
That the socialized mind, because you begin to develop the internal psychology that permits socialization, that permits you to become a member of a tribe, that permits you to become a part of a community of interest larger than one, larger than your own self-interest. Where you
now, part of what's interesting is that community actually scales down to people at earlier stages of development for like 5th and 6th graders. If you've ever, so I, growing up in the church context, regularly would be a teacher of people younger than myself, a day camp counselor, when I was a seminary intern, teaching vacation Bible school. And what you often find with little 5th and 6th graders is that these are hardcore legalists often in 5th and 6th grade. I mean, things are fixed, right and wrong, and there they are. And so, of course, you become a faithful member of the tribe by keeping the rules. Now, this individual who's out there stealing cars with a gang, now there's a little circle within that gang too that has rules that are enforced, and there's an ethos. In fact, it could be that you could interpret this entire little illustration as a competition between two cultures, because the culture that is drawing him in to steal the car is in competition with the culture that is saying, oh no, stealing cars is bad because it makes the owners who lose their cars feel bad. And you can see that this thing gets complex really quickly.
will be able to actually subordinate some of your maybe short-term interests on behalf of enhancing the relationship. And when that stage...
Whereas, in fact, with his gang, he was subordinating his relationship with the gang for his own longer-term self-interest.
Evolves typically in adolescence. It is a cause for relief and celebration on the part of parents and the community at large who live with this adolescent.
We have colonized him or her. They are now compliant. They understand.
It enables employers of fast food businesses who want to hire teenagers.
Oh, now you're reinforcing capitalism.
To feel they can hire a person who's begun to make that transition because they become trustworthy. You can kind of count on them. They may be able to keep their agreements. Not
They are a cog in the wheel.
just because they'll get into trouble if they don't, but because they want you to continue to trust them and to respect them and so on. And in very traditional societies, which for the most part don't exist anymore on our planet, where they're you could live with your whole life within a relatively contained kind of ecological niche, and where there was a single definition of how one should live and what it means to be an elder or what it means to be a man or a woman in this tribe, the socialized mind might have been completely adequate to the rest of one's life. But
Now, what he just said there, is this sort of a social Darwinian posture? It almost sounds, now on one hand, there's this sense of, well, development just keeps going, and these are some really fascinating ideas. And again, when you watch that I'm going to insert here, when you watch the little video from the pastor with the little pictures, you'll have a better understanding of what he's talking about. And again, I'm not looking to strawman him here, but he's really in some ways talking about, to a degree, a collective consciousness that is saying that people in traditional cultures didn't have a range for. Now, just offhand, that might sound, oh, okay, yeah, ancient peoples didn't know what we know, yada, yada, yada. It's sort of chronological snobbery. But then you say, okay, so Socrates never transcended this particular stage of development. Plotinus, I mean, I just posted the conversation with John Vervaeke. Gautama, Jesus. I'm going to talk to my friend who's a Singh, and he'll bring a whole bunch of other characters into the conversation. The point of his, he said, I want to do a video with you where I'm going to try and convert you on the air. I said, okay, that'll be fun. So there's a lot going on in his theory. Again, I find it interesting, and I like the tour he's giving me, but lots of questions. But he's not done, and I'm by no means going to finish this video in 7 minutes.
In a modern, increasingly postmodern world where we have so many different definitions of how one should live and who one should be, where there are increasing demands from all quarters for us to resolve complex.
And when I listen to him talk about that, and I just try to see the ancient world through the imagination of this, I picked up again Philip Jenkins' Lost History of Christianity, which is, I remember reading a review of the book, said this is an important history that deserves a better book than this. So, but it's the only book I got, so I'd picked that up a number of years ago and abandoned it, like I abandoned so many books. But I'm picking it up again because a friend on CRC Voices mentioned it again, and we seem to be back exploring the East now via Orthodoxy. Yet it almost seems that this is a picture looking back in time via the subtraction story of modernity. Even though he's going to, again, when I splice that video in here, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Problems where there's not a single unified set of expectations for us to align ourselves with, the socialized mind becomes inadequate to the task. What does it take?
And one must ask, what exactly is the task? To keep the young man from stealing cars? And I think in many ways that is the question that really haunts the meaning crisis. Proximal betterment, we're doing proximal betterment, but the presumption is that ultimate betterment is somehow self-evident. Yet, I think John Vervaeke says very well that it's the modern person who has all of the food they could ever want, all of the amusements and distractions they could ever want. They have almost everything they could ever want, and then they take their own life because life is meaningless. And what do all of, besides little moments of proximal betterment, what does all of this chasing after get us towards? Yeah, still hung up what I'm going to do with this video. So, but I've got to stop working on it right now. I'm at 1634, and part of how I do videos is that I watch something. Again, Paul Antleitner pointed this video to me, and I watched it once, and I thought, ooh. And then how do I decide what to do a video about? It's usually the thing that's sort of been haunting me, and I can't let it go. And so I've got to put it up in front of us and talk through it with you. And then those of you who are kind enough to watch the thing and leave a comment, then I can also see it through your comment. And, well, maybe it's at this point that I'll drop in that video. Anyway, here is the video. Robert Keegan's 5 Orders of Consciousness, an animated guide by Steve Thomason. If you go to Steve Thomason's YouTube page, so then I went there, and then I saw the introductory video, and oh, come on, you get the link. Yeah, there's the link to he's got a website, and on his website, he said he's a pastor, so I went to About. And so he described himself, I'm an associate pastor of an Easter Lutheran church, a post-evangelical, missional, neo-Lutheran theologian and artist. I have a PhD in missional leadership from Luther Seminary. It's my desire to continually create visual, innovative educational material for missional church and anyone who seeks to grow in love and grace of God. I write and draw about spiritual formation, biblical studies, theology, and art. And then he basically gives with his introductory video on his YouTube channel, pretty much says, use my stuff however you like. So when I saw that, I thought, I will. So maybe I'll drop this in now, and then that, because I've seen it already, and I've already digested it once, and so that will maybe help if I come back to this and do more commentary on it. So...
Okay, we're here looking at Robert Keegan's book, In Over Our Heads. It was written in 1994, and I've been reading this book for my independent study. And here's the chart from the inside of the book. Keegan talks about 5 orders of consciousness, and I want to see if I can sketch this out in a sketch kind of way that will make sense to me, and hopefully it might make sense to you. So the first thing I want to do is just start sketching. Keegan talks about the 5 orders of consciousness in regard to human development. And so the first order of consciousness is really about children. The little guy I'm drawing here is first order of consciousness is really between like 2 years old and 6 years old. You see, I've got a little dog, and the dog turns into a dragon because dragons are awesome. And when you're a small child, there's really no difference. There's no separation between our imagination and our reality. So over here, I've got a little fairy, and the fairy's doing pixie dust. And I'm going to start coloring this guy in now. And so the point about this kind of consciousness is that there is no barrier between reality and imagination. They all come from our mind. Okay, I'll move this over a little bit. Now, Keegan, in each of these 5 orders, he talks about 3 different lines of development. The first is the cognitive line, and he uses purple to indicate the cognitive line. That is how we process things. So what we've got here is in the first order of consciousness, there's perceptions. We're just perceiving things around us. We're not distinguishing them. Now, the second order line of development is in green, and these are the interpersonal lines. And at the first order of consciousness, we have social perceptions where we can tell that there are people around us, but they kind of blur with our fantasy. Then the third kind line of development is red, which is the intrapersonal line. And this is how we deal with ourself. And at the first order of consciousness, everything is really built upon impulses. We don't really distinguish ourself as a self. So this is what Keegan calls the first order of consciousness. So I'm going to move this over here, and you'll see what I'm going to do now is that the thing about these consciousness, these orders, is that they enfold each other. So you can see this first order of consciousness is inside the mind of this next figure. And this character is getting a little bit bigger. And hey, there's a second character. And this character is separate from the first. And there's a dog, and there's a tree, And what's happening, you can see in this second character that the subject is now looking at the objects, but the object has within it the first order of consciousness. And that's a big thing, the subject-object differences. And what's really going on here in this second order of consciousness is that the subject is now being able to distinguish what he calls durable categories. You'll see that we've got concrete cognition, we've got point of view in the interpersonal, and then enduring dispositions, needs, and preferences within ourself. Now he calls these things durable categories. This second order of consciousness happens between ages 6 and 10. These are elementary school age kids that are dealing with these durable categories. And it's an important phase where these kids are smart, they can repeat facts, but the world is very concrete. And this is what the second order of consciousness is all about. Now, I'm going to move this over to the side here, and you'll see that we've got the second order, which has the first order in it, goes into the mind of the new character. Now you can see that this character is getting a little bit bigger. The subject is now in adolescence, and the other object is also a subject, and this is a female. So now we have this distinction between male and female. We got to put inside the female's head there that she also has the first and second order of consciousness within her. And the subject and object are now observing each other and understanding that there is this difference between them, but that they can communicate with one another. And so now we can deal in the realm of abstractions. We have mutuality and interpersonalism. We have inner state, subjectivity, and self-consciousness. And Keegan says this is cross-categorical and trans-categorical. And this is the third level of consciousness. At this point, Keegan starts doing something where he takes the levels of consciousness and he matches them up with historical epochs in Western society. And he says that third level consciousness is like traditionalism, where people see themselves in the role in society, but the society themselves is not obvious to their subject. And so that's third level consciousness. Now, these two have a relationship with each other, but I'm going to put a circle around these two, and it's going to become a bounded set where in the fourth order of consciousness, we start realizing that our own society is just a society among other societies, and that there are spaces in between these societies. Now, you see our fourth order character, he's getting a little older. This is a middle-aged person. But notice that this person is once again outside. The subject is now outside of the objects and observing. This is modernism. The idea that there is such a thing as objective knowing. We can see abstract systems. We understand institution and relationship regulating forms. And we are aware of ourself. So it's all about self-regulation, self-authorship, and self-formation. This is fourth order consciousness. Now, Keegan's title for his book is In Over Our Heads. And an important thing to remember is what he's saying is that in order for adults to actually survive in the modern era, they have to develop fourth order consciousness to be able to see systems as objects, to come outside of them, to see them, how they fit together. But he said that now, in the late 20th century, in late modernism, or what some people call postmodernism, we're faced with a new challenge. You'll notice that the modernist fourth order person was a middle-aged character. Well, now people are living longer, and there is a sense of wisdom from age that's developing in our cognition and in our realization that the modern era of the subject being an objective observer is really false. And so in this fifth order of consciousness that only comes with maturity, we start seeing that there is this interconnectedness between subject, object, and subject, and that it is no longer that there is one object, one person is a complete autonomous self, while the other person is a complete autonomous self, and that in their relationship, they choose to come into relationship with one another. But what fifth order consciousness is starting to see is that it is only in the relationship between the subjects that the true fullness of the subject comes into being. And as you can see, this older man and woman, they're now holding hands. They are connected in a very special way that goes beyond this detached observation of the other, but they connect. And you see that I've painted everything blue, but now we're going to see that a new phenomenon happens, that they start, by their interconnection with each other, they actually bring out a difference in each other, and they're changing each other's color. They become more of who they really are by being interconnected with each other. And then you can see that this goes beyond just individuals in relationship with each other, but also within systems. Each system, as the modernist understood, each system is its own system, but those systems are intertwined with each other. They're not separate with spaces in between, but the systems need to understand that they're interwoven, and that as they seek to understand each other, their colors merge and mesh, and they see that all of reality is shaped by the relationship between them. So this is what he calls a dialectical cognition with interinstitutional relationship between forms, a transformational interpenetration of selves. This is the fifth order of consciousness, which is postmodernism. Okay, now Keegan uses a metaphor, an analogy from geometry to help us understand how these orders work. First of all, you have a single point. That's what the first order of consciousness is like. But if you have a line is actually made up of several points. And a plane is made up of several lines, and that is third order. So you have first, second, and third order of consciousness. Now, if you have several planes put together, it makes up a three-dimensional space called a cube or a box, and that is fourth order consciousness. And, I was trying to figure out what is fifth order consciousness, and I was talking to my son about it, and he said, it's kind of like a tesseract. So we went online, and let's look up what a tesseract is, and you'll see that a tesseract is something where it's beyond three dimensions, where these dimensions, these three-dimensional objects, are actually interwoven and interpenetrating each other. So I'm wondering if perhaps fifth order consciousness is a tesseract to its box, as a box is to its plane, as a plane is to its line, and as a line is to its points on that line. So I think we've done it. This is Robert Keegan's 5 Orders of Consciousness.
This has got to be one of the strangest commentary videos I've ever made, because now it's the third day and I'm still not done with it. So part of me was tempted to sort of abandon it, but each time I think about abandoning it, I come back to the main video itself and I watch it and I think, no, this is just sparking so many reflections that I want to want to keep going with it. So what was that, 1634?
I respect that that's your expectation, but if parent, employer should be by kind of socialized mind becomes inadequate to the task. What does it take? What does it take to...
And there's just so much good stuff in this video. So the socialized mind, that's the mind. I've just intersected that little video from that other pastor that I gave the little introduction to. I have to remember that I do it here. When I edit, I actually have to edit this video because I'm putting that video in. Because I'm trying to be efficient with time, because I just don't have time to sit and keep watching. That's the downside of the way I do my commentary videos. But what did he say again?
What does it take? What does it take to not just accommodate yourself to what is expected and to be shaped by kind of the environment, but to begin to create an internal authority, an internal compass, an internal way that becomes a filter through which you evaluate the many claims on your attention and on your values.
Okay, so he recognizes the points that I made before about what simply being colonized or assimilated into the expectations and desires of those with whom you share a community, that itself is insufficient. Well, insufficient to what? Well, insufficient to after the Bishop Barron Four Horsemen video, the three transcendentals, as they're called, to truth, goodness, and beauty. And he recognizes that there needs to be an agent, and we need to have agency in filtering what comes to us from our surroundings. And now I think here is where we again begin to see the rise of the secret sacred self, because this he describes as being inside. I've been watching videos on Neoplatonism, and I led off with a little one from the Wheaton class. Where we locate that geographically seems to matter. Does it come to us from above? Is it inside and welling out? The fact that inside and welling out, of course, feels to us in our buffered selves a little less. It's socially acceptable, because down from above is not acceptable publicly. It's not acceptable in the public domain in modernity, because there's a ceiling up there and we've been cut off. And so all of that language has to stop. So the source of agency has to come from someplace. So now suddenly it's coming from within and it's going out, and this is going to be the filter. Now, again, we might imagine that, well, this should be the accumulation of all of the whole show, as C.S. Lewis says in his book Miracles, that all of this is somehow being processed and that's what's coming out. And the reason that there are differences between us is because, sort of the butterfly effect in terms of human agency. We're all different because we've had various different inputs, but it's all finally a great machine. We're not going to be satisfied with that, because that's going to invoke a near immediate meaning crisis. So now we're going to have to get at the question of the source of the agency, but he's not going to go there. So in other words, it's got to be inside coming out.
Where you look at the expectations as they come in from your society or from your employer, from your intimate partner, and you say, you hopefully say,
because at the heart of the meaning crisis is the ontology of the I.
Respect that's your expectation, but I also entitle myself to make a certain judgment as to whether I want to meet that expectation exactly like that. Well, all of that, the ability to do those things, which is increasingly required almost of any of us now in this complex world in adulthood, requires a qualitatively different stage than the socialized mind as valuable as that evolution was in adolescence. It requires the ability not just to be written upon by your surround, by your culture, to be authored by your culture, but to sort of pick up that psychological pen yourself and to author your own identity, your own set of beliefs.
Here we have a self-authoring program.
And that authoring makes you then more of a personal authority. And that's why we call that the self-authoring stage. And that transformation, the gradual transformation from the socialized mind, where you are a good member of the tribe, so to speak, to the self-authoring mind, where you remain, obviously, a member of your community, but you're able to almost interrogate a bit its own rules and expectations and maybe act on them. And that is your way, actually, through your own development, of enhancing the culture and the surround in which you live, instead of just imbibing it.
Now, again, so there's different directions here, and the geography matters. Development is almost a ground up, but the I is an inside out, and it's the filter. And of course, the one movement that we cannot have is down and through.
And sort of taking it in, you now have the ability to step back a bit from these expectations and sort of make judgments about them. This is a tremendously empowering and inspiring move as you come into your own voice. But before...
And notice all of this is, it's all of this direction is, it's the creation of the self. And in some ways, perhaps, I mean, is this capable of addressing the meaning crisis? Because again, we're simply assuming the agency, but there's no account for the agency. It is what it is. It is development from below. It is emergence.
Or you confidently move into the self-authoring stage, as with any transition, there is often a lot of terror and anticipated loss. And if I object to the existing social and interpersonal arrangements that I've long been kind of contracting to, what will be the results? Will you still love me? Will I be put out of my society? These are all the questions that come up at the beginning kind of this transition. This gradual transformation, which typically doesn't begin until the 20s and may not begin for someone until their 40s, or may not ever occur for them, is the most dynamic and gradual transformation in adult development, the move from the socialized to the self-authoring mind. But, and I'll try to say this quickly because I know I'm going on for a long time, it's not the final stage of development to put together your own internal authority. There can come a time.
And again, even when you say do it that way, so you're putting together your own internal authority. Now, of course, you're not doing this necessarily consciously, but and I think he is really describing he is articulating the current sense in society of who we are and how we become. But again, this crisis is, it can no longer be a God performing this upon us. It has to be us doing this ourselves, and we have to come up from below, and this is a process of evolutionary natural development that we have this capacity, but all of that development always puts at risk that this agent isn't simply, again, the product of the whole show, as Lewis calls it in his book Miracles.
Time in your own evolution where you come to recognize that as powerful as your own inner compass enables you to be.
Now, inner compass is also a very interesting little word image, because a compass, of course, reads magnetism in the environment. It doesn't just read the self. It is something that has to be transjective in and out.
That inevitably your system for making meaning with which you've become identified has limitations, has blind sides, leaves something out, privileges something and disadvantages something else. And as you come to
see, and now when you get to this point and the notes he wants to make, now this again is leaning much more towards the whole show. Of course you have blind sides because your experience is limited. In other words, the secret sacred self isn't infallible.
see those limits, you have the potential now to again step away from something you have been completely embedded in. That is the gradual move of development, that you move from being subject to a way of making meaning to be able to step back from it.
And what does he mean by making meaning? I think he's meaning it's self-authoring of your map. Okay, so I did a couple of conversations today that will come out on the channel. They were both excellent. They're excellent in my opinion. We'll see what you think. But a big part of what we're sense making is, so one of the individuals I talked about was, he's from India originally. He lived in Texas for a while. He's in Montreal now, but he described a number of transformations in his life and a number of events in his life that forced him to make sense of the world yet again. Okay, we talk that way. What do we mean? Basically, we have a map, we have an internal map, and that map is a filter through which things come to us. I'm thinking in sort of Thomas Kuhn, History of Scientific Revolutions. It's a filter in which things come to us, and at some point, once enough data comes to threaten the integrity of the map, we have to make sense of the world once again. We have to redo our map, and that can be, and the redoing of the map is in many ways one of these transformations that we're talking about. And so it's that way that we're making sense, and often this common meaning making we're doing is the process of, again, the first personal and the third personal, and the going back and forth between them of okay, these happened in the world, these are in the map, and we're just, the constant checking between them is in fact, a map of meaning.
And turn that into object, so you can now look at it, be in some relationship to it, and you begin to construct a new subjectivity, one which, in the Wilburian phrase, transcends but includes the prior way of knowing. And that, in the present instance that we're discussing, this ability to actually step back from your own inner system begins a new voyage, a new transitional journey that can lead to yet a qualitatively more encompassing system, what we call the self-transforming mind. So instead of being just identified with the particular form you have created, you can now kind of see yourself as a self that creates forms, that can move from one form to another, that can hold multiple forms together. It enables you to not just be a faithful abider of the law and someone who stands within this impressive system of law that guarantees rights to given individuals, even if I don't know you and I'm not related to you by blood and so on.
Now, how the law fits into this is very interesting, because within this system, the law is always simply a product of sociality. I posted on Twitter today that a friend came in, and he'll be on the channel pretty soon. He came into my office, and he's been working at a local high school, and a couple of observations he made. One, he asked the kids in his class, how many of you are currently living with both of your biological parents? 2 children raised their hand. One was a girl in a hijab who was Muslim, and another a little boy who was Sikh. Everyone else, no one else in the class is living with both of their biological parents. And then he said, he began asking them questions about sources of morality, and discovered that, these are high school kids, so cut them a little slack, but it's data. They're all ardent relativists. And you can almost hear this within the system because, laws are simply the social agreement that we are in. That's very different, of course, from, let's say, a divine law, that a law somehow, I know, natural law, yeah, I hear you, Bionic Mosquito and Carl, that the laws, the human laws somehow should reflect these divine laws. And again, whether the word law is the best word on there, but should reflect the divine will, should reflect the divine created order, use the Dutch Calvinist word, and the law should reflect that. So it's interesting how with the secret sacred self, laws also, it's just simply a function of community. And these high school kids, he was even sort of, this individual is himself Sikh. So that'll become clear when we do our conversation. He was kind of sort of poking at them like, does that mean like the Holocaust was right for Nazi Germany because, it felt authentic to them? Oh yeah, that certainly sort of makes sense in their reason. He was a little horrified of the world that we have created in our youth. But so here in this point, when you get into law, there's some of that going on there too.
Which is what the fourth order is able to do, starts constructing these institutions that are sort of outward reflections of the internal.
And the fourth order, again, is that little video that I inserted there. You can find that.
Internal institution that you have constructed. But in this next transition, you can actually step back and say, it's great that we have this legal system, but just like my own internal system, that legal system is always imperfect. We might discover one day, oh my goodness, why don't we let women vote? And we kind of see that, up until now, we've kind of...
Now, that move right there, there's always the pristine, sacred, naive. And in some ways, the sacred is always naive because it is pure. So, women should vote. That's self-evident. Well, where does that come from? And why did it take us so long to discover? Can you answer that? And what in our world, of course, because once you have sort of a developmental assumption behind it, what in our world will be something like only male suffrage? I've been reading Will Durant's treatment of the Napoleonic era, his 11th volume of the History of Civilization. And it's just such a fun writer sometimes. It's amazing in this radical French Revolution how many of these issues that today, are easily with us. All property holding males should vote. Oh, okay. Well, then finally, universal male suffrage. Nowhere in the French Revolution, for as radical as it became, did they expect women to vote. That would just be crazy. So what in our world for 100 years from now, if you maintain sort of this progressivist imagination, what in our world would be just those barbarians, they refused children the rights of sexual gratification with expert leaders. Is that where this is going? So
excluded a certain group, then we have the opportunity to act upon that system and reconstruct it. So you have meta structures like within the US system, pardon the parochialism, we have like a Supreme Court, many democracies have. That Supreme Court actually is an expression of the ability to say that it's important to sustain a system, but it's also important to have a position to reflect on that system and see when it has limitations. So you actually have to reconstruct those laws. Well, that, I'm just using that as
Sort of made the Supreme Court divine.
almost an analogy on the political front, is what is happening psychologically, where you can still honor your form, but you have a certain humility that recognizes it has limitations. So those are the three qualitatively different stages of development in adulthood: the socialized mind, being a good member of the tribe, to the self-authoring mind, where you begin to construct some of the terms by which you are going to be, a member of a tribe or of a relationship. It's not like relationships are not important to you anymore, but instead of being utterly shaped by them, you begin to bring certain criteria to them about how you want your relationships to be, the self-authoring mind, and then the possibility of actually being able to interrogate now, not just the expectations and rules of the society, but to interrogate your own internal system, which brings into being this third qualitative way of knowing or filter on the world that we call the self-transforming mind. That's a quick summary of 30 years of research, David.
And again, it's interesting because this is research. Well, what does that mean? He's looking at a whole bunch of data. Okay. But I've been thinking about this a lot with these compression schemes and narrative and non-narrative, where he looks at all of this and he tries to make sense of it. Okay, what does that mean? Is my volume low? I'm going to turn it up a little bit. He tries to make sense of it. Okay. He's trying to map it. And what he just did was give us his map. But again, well, maybe I'm doing this, now we're looking at the map and we're asking hard questions about the map. I'm going to skip ahead he talked about Ken Wilber and the spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber's schema. Now he's going to talk about hierarchy.
One of the things that Ken said in the interview with us that he did was that because developmental theory implicitly involves kind of hierarchies of cognition or hierarchies of development, there was a real move against it in the 1960s. And I think what he said was the developmentalists circled the wagons at Harvard, and he mentioned your name and a few other people. Is that true? And has that changed in any way, or is there still a kind of taboo around this idea of hierarchies?
And did you have wagons?
Well, first, I think that the trigger or the alert that goes up when anyone is faced with a hierarchy is something that ought to be respected. Because anytime somebody seems to be suggesting that something is better than something else, it's a smart question to say, on what basis, are you making this claim? And underneath that question is probably a not totally unfounded suspicion that whoever's making that claim is going to benefit from the hierarchy they've created. That whoever's making that claim feels like they're somewhere near the top of that hierarchy.
A hermeneutic of suspicion. It's got a degree of validity to it.
So, I teach this stuff over and over again to students who may be coming to it for the first time. And you ask, is this kind of response, diminishing? No, I mean, it comes up every single time I'll teach this class. And it comes up because, my students are often people who have moved to a place of a kind of greater respect for difference and who have come maybe to recognize their own tendency towards judgmentalism and who are privileging their own kind of progressive or more liberal spirit that, we shouldn't be saying that one thing's better than another. And I very much enjoy...
Which is, of course, hilarious because we shouldn't be saying one thing is better than another. You just did. One thing is better than another. One thing is not better than another. We shouldn't be saying that. He's just privileged. I mean, that's just always the fun with this kind of thing.
Welcoming in the forms of discomfort and provocation that a hierarchical system presents to people. And I encourage them to ask themselves, on what basis is this hierarchy constructed? And is it privileging and advantaging somebody? Like if it's constructed by a white guy from the Western world who's not poor, is it basically advantaging that? But the best way that we
Then it must be evil.
get at this is by showing people that they hold a hierarchic theory themselves. The hierarchic theory doesn't come from me. It doesn't come from Ken, and it doesn't come from developmental theory. I can show people a piece of film of somebody talking, and you begin to get a sense of how they're constructing the world. And I can ask them, if this person were to undergo a transformative process, if they were to have a valuable therapy experience, or life itself were to be a great teacher for them, can you imagine some other way that they might construct experience that you would consider is not just a different way, but you would actually say you think that that way of constructing is actually more adequate, that it has a better grasp on reality, that it would make them a better parent in relationship to their child for them to have made that kind of move? I never get any resistance to that question. People can say, oh, well, yes, I think if she were less concerned with what other people thought about her all the time, she would actually be happier herself. She'd probably be a better mother as well. Right now, she's being led around, by her own daughter because she fears her daughter's disapproval of her. She feels like if she doesn't answer certain questions, she's being impermissibly secretive instead of being appropriately private and having a notion of boundaries, and that there's some things you just don't tell your kid. People become very, very eloquent in expressing what they think would be a better way of handling the given dilemma that they can see in that piece of film. And after they've done that, I tell them, wow, you're pretty judgmental people, as it turns out. You think that this other way is not just different, but actually better? They say, yes, they think it. So I say, okay, which one of us has a hierarchy? The reality
I love that section. It's good.
is that, no adult feels at all provoked by the notion that a 10-year-old who realizes they're never going to get older than their older brother, that they're not going to change gender, that when they move in one direction and someone else moves in the other direction, the moon can't follow us both. These are all things that 4-year-olds believe. There's nobody who feels that the 10-year-old, doesn't have a clearer grasp of reality when they begin to distinguish between fantasy and reality, as every child does between the ages of 4 and 10. People are completely at ease with hierarchic notions of how we construct reality when they're talking about children. But when you start introducing those same ideas into the realm of adulthood, it is understandably, provocative. But it's important for people to see.
And especially in academia?
Yeah, probably.
Why was there such a resistance against it in academia?
Anyway, so I wanted to get that little bit in because it was a good little rant. So anyway, yeah, I think that's enough of this. It's taking me 4 sittings, and I don't know how long this is going to be, especially once I splice the other piece in. And when I do things like this, I have a difficult time summarizing it because unless I sit down and review what I've made, so it's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge. But I wanted to walk through some of his ideas, and just note that certainly he and I would be in agreement in hierarchies, but where I started with this, I believe, is that what we're really looking for somehow is basically a chain of betterment. And that's a quest that we're always in. And it's not only a chain of betterment as individual in terms of an individual transformation, but it's a chain of betterment in terms of communal transformation. It's in many ways it's progressive in that we together wish to progress. We wish for our community to get better. We wish to know the truth better. We wish to be able to participate in and embody the beautiful and the true and the good. So these theories of self, I think, there's a tremendous amount to learn from them, but they're very much worth interrogating and asking hard questions, especially about how modernity and secularity impinge on these and how they're reshaped by them. So leave a message. Let me know what you think.